Welcome back to your ultimate pit stop, Piston Pundit, where engines rev, policies stall, and we don't just talk torque, we dissect the geopolitical nuts and bolts affecting the entire automotive world. Today, we're diving into a story that's less about horsepower and more about heavy-handed policy. US President Donald Trump's tariff blitz, which aimed to bully 150 nations into trade submission, and ended up triggering a global backlash that's left markets reeling and businesses bracing for impact. It all started with a bold claim and ended with billions lost, inflation creeping in, and America's trade reputation running on fumes. Let's break it down. Tariff Gambit or economic backfire? On April 2nd, Trump announced Liberation Day, rolling out a sweeping 10% tariff on most U.S. imports, with punitive rates up to 50% for specific countries. Then, in Abu Dhabi weeks later, he cranked up the pressure, declaring that 150 nations would receive letters detailing what they'd have to pay to keep trading with the U.S. But this tough talk missed the mark. According to Bloomberg and Reuters, allies like Japan and the EU were blindsided. The so-called letters, they were placeholders, desperate substitutes for failed negotiations. Former U.S. Trade Rep Susan Schwab noted, "There's no legal precedent for setting tariffs via memo." Even White House insiders called them stopgap tactics. Markets didn't flinch, they tanked. The S&P 500 nosedived 5.3%, erasing $1.8 trillion in value. Foreign leaders went silent, and U.S. businesses panicked over looming cost spikes with no clear guidance. Economists laid it bare. Tariffs are import taxes, paid mostly by American companies. The CBO confirmed 92% of the burden stayed stateside. Trump wasn't opening negotiations, he was sending out collection notices. But the financial fallout didn't stop there. Let's take a closer look at how these tariffs lit a fuse under America's inflation engine. Price hikes, panic, and Main Street mayhem. By late April, the economic blowback from Trump's tariffs was no longer just policy chatter, it was hitting wallets. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported a 0.7% spike in core consumer prices, with electronics, home goods, and clothing taking the hardest hits. Walmart warned of price hikes on over 8,000 products, and Target echoed concerns tied to tariffs from China, India, and Mexico. Big box chains could cushion the blow. Small businesses, not so lucky. Nearly half of them froze hiring or delayed investments, and over 1,300 filed for bankruptcy in April alone, a 23% surge year over year. In small towns where margins are as thin as an oil filter gasket, the impact was devastating. Consumers weren't blind to it. The University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index showed 74% of Americans now viewed tariffs as a top concern, up from 58% just a month prior. With rising costs on everyday essentials, middle-class households were tightening belts, and confidence was crumbling. Before we shift gears, hit that like and subscribe button to stay in the loop on trade turmoil, car tech, and everything revving across the global auto landscape. We're just getting into the real breakdown. Now let's look under the hood of Trump's bold claim. 90 deals in 90 days, and see how quickly the engine of diplomacy started to sputter. Deal-making delays and diplomatic blowouts. 90 deals in 90 days. That was the sales pitch. But by mid-May, Trump's trade scoreboard looked more like a blank invoice. Only 2 deals were announced, and both lacked legal horsepower. The UK agreement was little more than a press release disclaimer, and the China framework was still in the sketch phase, lacking enforceable terms. Other negotiations hit speed bumps, or worse, dead ends. Japan wanted all tariffs dropped, including Trump's new 10% baseline. South Korea tapped the brakes, citing internal political transitions. And countries like Vietnam and India were locked in gridlock over potential tariff rates as high as 46%. Things got murkier under the hood. Treasury projections warned that the ripple effects could push inflation past 5% and slash $200 billion from annual consumer spending. On April 15th, the administration hit pause, rebranded as a tactical reset. but behind the scenes, it looked more like a pit stop with no pit crew. Internal memos leaked to the press painted a picture of chaos, and investors kept their wallets parked in neutral. With that said, let's take a closer look at how shifting signals in Washington paralyzed businesses from coast to coast. Policy whiplash and economic gridlock. Tariffs only work when businesses can plan around them, but the Trump administration's constant pivots left companies guessing. In April alone, U.S. manufacturing investment dropped 11%, the steepest monthly decline since the early pandemic. Retailers cut back inventories, fearing sudden 50% tariffs. Even giants like General Electric slammed the brakes on expansion. A May 15th McKinsey report revealed that 62% of CEOs delayed major projects due to trade unpredictability. While Trump touted $12 trillion in future investment, many of those plans were either recycled announcements or still on the drawing board. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick called it strategic ambiguity, but business leaders had another word for it: paralysis. With no clear roadmap, companies couldn't price materials, negotiate contracts, or scale operations confidently. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's floated idea of regional tariff zones, different rates by region, only added fuel to the fog. The result? A fractured, high-stakes guessing game that left America's industrial engine idling when it should have been racing forward. And as domestic businesses faltered, the global response was anything but passive. Backlash and the breakdown of trust. Trump's tariff offensive aimed to push allies into compliance, but it triggered resistance instead. The EU geared up $100 billion in retaliatory tariffs. Canada struck a $14.2 billion LNG deal with China, bypassing the US entirely. Vietnam walked away from talks, calling the terms unrealistic, and France flatly labeled the US an unreliable partner. Trust took a nosedive. Former National Economic Council Director Gary Cohn nailed it on CNBC. Trump misunderstood tariffs. He thought foreign governments paid them. They don't. US businesses do. That miscalculation rattled confidence across global markets. By late May, US exports dipped 2.1% in Q2. Oxford Economics warned GDP could shrink by $128 billion if the policy stuck. Retailers reported import cost hikes of up to 19%, especially in electronics and home goods. Even Walmart flagged the increases as permanent. As we approach Trump's July 9th deadline, let's examine what this all means for the long-term picture. The final toll: tariffs, tensions, and the price of policy. Trump's aggressive tariff play was meant to shift global trade into America's lane, but it spun the economy into a skid. Inflation surged, deals stalled, and allies turned away. Now that chaos is showing up in price tags, lost exports, and shrinking confidence. With the July 9th tariff snapback deadline approaching, the road ahead remains uncertain. Will we see smart diplomacy, or a pileup of protectionism? One thing's clear: this strategy has already redrawn the trade map in ways few expected. Let's open up the throttle in the comments section. Were these tariffs a smart negotiating tactic, or just reckless throttle control? Has America's role in global trade shifted lanes for good? And what are the long-term effects on automakers and parts suppliers caught in this policy storm? Sound off below. We'd love to hear your take. And don't forget to subscribe to Piston Pundit so you never miss the next big update in the world of vehicles, trade, and policy power plays. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time. Feel free to explore more of our videos on screen. There's always something revving on the horizon.